Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Tuesday, the 25th of February, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby, filling in for Mark this morning. Start off with a quick admin note. We're going to put a link to the 2025 member survey in this morning's report. So if you are an early warning member and you have not taken that survey, please do. It's just a few minutes long. It's going to help us direct our efforts for the rest of this year and beyond. And with that, let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway. Good morning, Robert. Let's start off here. There's Republicans are up against this 14 March potential government shutdown. I've noticed that some progressive groups are actually pushing Democrats to force that shutdown to happen. But let's start with here. What are senators doing to implement a stopgap to avoid the shutdown?
Good morning, Mike. So it's actually from one of the top appropriators in the Senate, Susan Collins. She's a Maine Republican, and she's actually calling for a continuing resolution to avert that possible shutdown. Apparently in the Senate right now, there's an issue with uncertainty over White House opposition to these spending bills, and some negotiations between Democrats and Republicans have stalled because there's disagreement over funding levels over both defense and non-defense spending. And then Trump also said yesterday that the 25% tariffs against Canada and Mexico are actually going to take effect on the 4th of March. He said they're going forward on time and on schedule. I did see an interesting comment from a U.S. official speaking anonymously that said that these 25% tariffs are actually still not, for sure going to happen, which I think is a signal that Trump is using these, still using this as a stick in the his approach to Canada and Mexico on trade. But this official did say that those reciprocal tariffs that we've talked about against all U.S. trade partners is going to move forward in April. Mm-hmm. And then, Jared, if you can move the slide. It looks like the Trump resistance is starting to make moves in the Congress, and this is both in the Senate and the House. In the Senate, Tim Kaine, he's a Democrat from Virginia. He introduced what's called Senate Joint Resolution 10, and this is to end President Donald Trump's declared national energy emergency. And something I saw that might be a bit more consequential in the House, Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries said he wants all House Democrats to have what he called, quote, maximum attendance this week. And the idea is to disrupt Speaker Mike Johnson's vote on a House budget reconciliation bill that was expected to start as early as tonight. And I think Democrats are attempting, I think, delaying actions in the Congress until the midterm. But this Democrat maximum attendance is going to force the GOP to have full attendance to pass any resolutions and bills because they have to have at least 218 votes to get a bill passed, which would be the simple majority in the House. And Johnson can really only afford to lose one Republican vote right now. And there are 3 Republicans that are currently signaling they're going to vote down this budget reconciliation bill. And I think another thing that Democrats have been doing recently and are going to continue doing is using these debates on these bills to push a messaging campaign against the Trump administration on some of these key topics like energy.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, we're going to circle back and talk a little bit more about what's going on in Congress. Robert, I just want to note briefly, there are 2 interesting hearings coming up. House Oversight is holding a hearing on emerging global threats. And over in the House Judiciary, they have a hearing today on ending the weaponization of the Justice Department. We will monitor those. And if anything has intelligence value, we'll throw it in tomorrow's report. All right, let's go ahead and jump into the roll-ups here, starting with the Trump administration planning to expand China chip curbs, which is something that Biden introduced. Go ahead.
Yeah, and this is actually a follow-on to the Biden administration's efforts. And the Trump officials are meeting with both Japanese and Dutch officials, and they're trying to get them to restrict Japanese and Dutch chip technology from providing parts and maintenance for semiconductor equipment in China. And I thought this was interesting because there was the Biden administration move was largely unilateral and did have a lot of blowback on U.S. companies. And it looks like we talked about yesterday with the attempts of the Trump administration to go after the Chinese tech sector. I think they're also trying, they're also reaching out and trying to get our allies and trade partners to also put up this wall against China, which is I think could be more effective than what the Biden administration put forward. And then yesterday, Trump also called for the Keystone XL pipeline to restart construction. And he said that he's also going to ease regulatory approvals for the project. And just for context, the Keystone XL pipeline was planned to transport oil from Western Canada to U.S. refiners and was canceled in 2021 after President Biden revoked a key permit for the project. And then yesterday, 2 sanctuary cities in Massachusetts also filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration. And this was in response to executive orders that said they were going to freeze federal funding for state and local governments with sanctuary policies. The cities actually claimed that this threat to freeze federal funding violated the city's constitutional rights, which I think is an interesting argument. However, there is precedent for the federal government doing this, and has threatened to stop federal funding to state and local governments in the past over policy outcomes that the federal government wants. So I think it's an open question of whether they're actually going to win in this lawsuit or not.
Okay. All right. And then if the Trump administration loses, is this going to be escalated to the Supreme Court?
I think so. And then it will become, I think the Supreme Court is likely to side with the Trump administration on this one, just because the federal government has done this most famously with the drinking age, threatened highway funding through the Department of Transportation to get states to raise their drinking age from 18 to 21, decades ago. And since then, there's been other times where the federal government has threatened to freeze federal funding. So I think the precedent is on the Trump administration side.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, it's going to be a busy few years for the Supreme Court, and that means more protests against Supreme Court also. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's move on here. Jared, go ahead and cover your roll-up items, starting with Japan preparing for these tariff negotiations.
Will do. So Japan's economy, trade, and industry minister is meeting with the heads of Japanese industry, particularly the steel and automotive industries, in order to find out what the exact lay of the land is, in order to present that to Howard Lutnick, our Commerce Secretary, next month. Taiwan just arrested this morning 8 Chinese nationals that they suspect of sabotaging an undersea cable connecting mainland Taiwan to Penghu Island, one of their very nearby offshore islands. It hasn't been confirmed yet, because it did happen this morning, that they definitely did, but they are suspected of it, and in Taiwan right now. And Israel's prime minister announced at a military ceremony this past weekend that Israel was, quote, prepared to resume intense fighting at any moment in order to, unquote, in order to achieve its war objectives if negotiations fail. At the same time, Egyptian media reported that Israel's government informed the United States that it was not committed to the 3-stage ceasefire plan for Gaza. Then lastly, President Trump hosted French President Emmanuel Macron yesterday to discuss the war in Ukraine, particularly having European troops ensuring Ukraine's security post-war in order to prevent another 2014 and 2022. But President Macron insisted that they need American backup to maintain credibility against the Russians.
Mm-hmm. Pretty stark reality there for the Europeans. So, I noted yesterday, or it has been noted previously also, the Brits have something like 25 operational main battle tanks, only 25 tanks. Germany cannot field a single division, and NATO takes months to produce what Russia produces in days in terms of arms. So obviously Europe and NATO in no condition to stave off the Russians. They should have, I guess they've known this for the better part of a decade, really since 2014. And reality is just kind of slapping them in the face, Jared.
Yeah, certainly seems that way. You would think, after 80 years of a Cold War, you would, I don't know, maintain your industrial base.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thanks for that, Jared. We're going to move on now to this morning's warning items, starting here with progressive groups are taking a victory lap after some disrupted town halls. You may have seen this video. There's a Republican representative. His name is Rich McCormick. He is from Georgia. And last week he held a town hall that was disrupted by activist boos and jeers. In this video, it was kind of testy. And progressive groups like Indivisible are applauding these protests targeting these town hall events because one of the effects of these protests is earlier this week, this representative, Rich McCormick, Republican from Georgia, urged the Trump administration to slow down on these budget cuts that are being recommended by the Department of Government Efficiency. He said on a recent podcast, he said, quote, "I think we're moving just a little too fast. We should have impact studies on each department as we do it." And he continues, "I would rather see us take a deep breath, move a little bit slower and a little bit more deliberately. That's kind of generally the feeling of a lot of people. I want to make sure we're doing the right thing." That's what he said. And again, these progressive groups are noting that disruptive protests against congressional Republicans are working to generate conservative pushback against the Trump agenda, a little brake pumping, if you will. And according to a recent email from Indivisible, which I think it's probably the largest progressive group in this country right now, or the progressive activist group in this country. They said in an email, quote, "We knew Trump would overreach. We knew there would be backlash. And we knew Indivisible's role in this period would be to organize that backlash into an effective opposition to stop us from falling over the brink." Indivisible also earlier this month, they did publish a field manual. We talked about it on the show that encouraged disruptive protests aimed at congressional Republicans and also against Tesla dealerships, as well as the opposition is only one piece of this strategy. The other part is pushing Democrats to be more aggressive in their opposition to the Trump agenda. And so Indivisible is spearheading this protest movement against the Trump administration because they have seen some positive effects. Expect it to ramp up because they're taking a victory lap and saying, look, we caused these conservative Republicans to publicly say the Trump administration may be making mistakes. And that's very important. Also, I would also note that they're also pressuring Democrats to leverage this potential 14 March government shutdown in order to end Doge and also in the SAVE Act. The SAVE Act is interesting. It's in the House right now. It could come up for a vote. I think maybe as soon as next week. It is going to require voters to show proof of citizenship either before they vote or before they register to vote. Robert, do you have the exact details on that?
I think it was actually both. I can double check for you, but yeah, I'm pretty sure it actually requires proof of citizenship to register.
Okay, gotcha. All right. Yeah, and Indivisible said this is going to disenfranchise tens of millions of Americans and et cetera, et cetera. What it will ensure is that only citizens are voting in the election. All right, moving on here. Morgan Stanley issued a note to clients last week, and they are saying that the world is, quote, entering a new phase of supply chain pressure. And this is because the phase of relatively simple nearshoring is complete. Basically, if it could be easily nearshored, it has been. And that is now leaving more complex supply chains now to be reoriented. They say, quote, policymakers are pursuing trade barriers and supply chain realignment in the name of national and economic security. This is not only the United States. We're also seeing this start from other countries as well. And analysts are describing three major challenges. Number one, they say the U.S. lacks manufacturing capacity. This is something the Trump administration is trying to solve. It's going to be a rocky road. It's going to be expensive. It's not going to be done overnight. But what's the alternative? The second major challenge is that China continues to take market share, meaning manufacturing market share. And finally, Mexico needs a lot of investment. And specifically, they need greenfield investment, not brownfield investment. Brownfield investment includes upgrading existing industrial facilities, while greenfield investment means they've got to go in and clear forests or clear fields or pastures and build new industrial areas. So this is a lot more expensive than just upgrading or retrofitting previous industrial facilities. So why it matters is this is signaling inflationary pressure to a lot of these investment banks. This is it probably tops the list of concerns that I see day in and day out because of the heavy lifting of supply chain reorientation is starting now. These shifts are more complex because they deal with more intricate inputs. There's more concentration because there are fewer key suppliers. And then finally, it's going to be more disruptive due to the distance of moving these complex manufacturing processes from the east to the west. And Morgan Stanley analysts say this new round of strained supply chains is going to be a quote unquote persistent risk that will result in some cases increased costs being passed along to consumers. So as we have expected for a long time, this is going to be inflationary. Now let's move over to Robert. This is interesting, Robert. You have former Cyber Command and former NSA Director General Nakasone saying that United States is falling behind adversaries in cyberspace. What's going on?
Yeah, this was actually at the District Con meeting in DC recently. I think it was at the end of last week or the beginning of this week. And this was in comments to some reporters, General Nakasone. He said that the U.S. is increasingly falling behind, foreign adversaries in cyberspace. But something that he said I thought was actually much more important was he said that we're starting to see the beginnings of the bleed from the non-kinetic to the kinetic for cyber operations. And this is very dangerous. This bleed into kinetic cyber operations is a major escalation. We could start seeing, because a lot of the U.S. cyber deterrence strategy and cyber defense strategy, was an attempt to determine what cyber attacks fall above and below the threshold for armed conflict. And there was in an attempt to keep cyber warfare between the U.S. and adversaries below that line. But if cyber attacks start becoming more kinetic, this increases the risk that not only could cyber attacks occur above the threshold of armed conflict, but it would also increase the risk of the U.S. misattributing some of these cyber attacks, because cyber attacks in general are already difficult to attribute to a state actor. A lot of the times when we report on like Silk Typhoon, those are determinations based on historic tactics, techniques, and procedures. And they're making an estimation that these are linked to China or Russia or Iran. You're muted, Mike.
I would also note, Robert, that a couple of years ago, I was talking to a friend who works in cybersecurity, and he was saying that some of these criminal cyber groups are using TTPs of Russian and state-backed hacking groups to make it appear that it's not criminal in focus, it's nation state in focus. And basically they're trying to cause the United States to misattribute these cyber exploitation cases to foreign countries. I thought that was interesting. And it really does underscore what you just said. Attribution is very difficult. Please continue.
Yeah, and it does become more dangerous because, from my understanding, generally what is above and below the threshold for armed conflict, in consideration by U.S. officials, is whether it causes a casualty or a mass casualty event. And he did talk about how there are either a lot of these cyber attacks have been, or what he's seeing is this bleed over is purely cyber attacks that end with a kinetic outcome. And I think that really increases the risk that if we misattribute one of these kinetic cyber attacks to a state actor, now we're ramping up the potential for some kind of conflict. When, like you said, some of these criminal groups are using the same TTPs and really kind of muddying the waters here. Nakasone did mention also another interesting comment on AI. He did say, as I think we've talked about before, that a lot of officials are worried AI is going to ramp up cyber offensive capabilities, but he did mention that they're seeing the use of AI in targeting for drones, which is also a big deal, because I think U.S. doctrine has generally been that if there's any AI use in operations, it's not supposed to be able to make the decision to actually attack a target. It's just supposed to identify targets. And in this case, he's talking about drones that could be basically autonomous and choose their targets and act on it without any human input.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, that is also a huge concern. Let's move on now to energy, because, Robert, previously over the past couple of years, we've talked about the Clean Power Plan 2.0, how we are essentially headed towards an energy shortfall because there's just not enough electricity that is being produced. And this is due going back to the Obama administration, and then the Biden administration continue these policies. And just as a reminder for folks, the strategy was to reduce fossil fuel, to take down coal-fired power plants and natural gas power plants and reduce them with green energy, quote unquote green energy. And the problem is reliability. And so we're already seeing power shortfalls, but this is something that the Trump administration is addressing very rapidly. And it seems like they're trying to actually, which is a good thing, prevent these energy shortages. So what's going on?
Yeah, and I think this recent National Governors Association is another sign. As we've been talking about, there are state level officials, utility operators, all warning for the last probably 2 years that we're headed towards these power shortages. Well, now it looks like both Republican and Democratic governors are taking notice. And this recent National Governors Association meeting in Washington, D.C., there were Democratic governors saying that they're going to pursue what they're calling an all of the above energy strategy, which would mean coal, hydrogen, nuclear, and clean energy. And there was actually a comment from Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro. He said that both Republican and Democratic governors all understand the importance of speeding up the energy permitting process. And this is, I thought this was a key comment because they have implemented in Pennsylvania significant energy permitting reforms. I think they gave like a maximum of 14 days for permitting for new power projects. And I think more states are going to follow their lead on this. I think Colorado has also done something similar, but they're at 30 days. Now, something I did see yesterday, the Trump administration is also, pushing permitting reform. And one of the things they're doing, they actually put up an interim final rule, or they're supposed to today, that's going to rescind all of the White House Council on Environment Quality regulations. And since the National Environmental Policy Act was passed in 1970, the Council on Environment Quality has kind of become the clearinghouse for all permitting rules. And now they're basically ending that and pushing this down to all federal agencies. Now, there's a kind of a catch here where the federal agencies are going to have until next year, till next February, to publish their own rules. And I did see there were some legal analysts saying that this could cause some problems like short-term, confusion for energy projects when it comes to regulatory issues and permitting. And it could also increase the risk that these projects will face lawsuits after the approval. And I think they're talking mostly about how these rapid changes in regulations are going to leave openings for like some green energy groups to file lawsuits claiming they didn't follow the correct process for permitting and all that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Robert, this still seems like a big risk here. Also, Ben asks, we'll just cover it now. 12 to 18 months ago, you started talking about potential for brownouts and blackouts if we continued down this trajectory of replacing replacing more reliable fossil fuel energy with less reliable green energy. There were some substantial shortfalls that we were headed for this year. And then I think through 2028 or something like that, the continued, the Clean Power Plan 2.0, if we had continued that, absolutely 100%, we would have seen like residential area electricity shortages. But Ben asks, have we averted that risk, or or could that still happen?
Well, I think there's still a risk. What I'm seeing is very positive in potentially averting that. Like these governors saying they're going to do this above plan. The Trump administration declared that national energy emergency. And a lot of talk from Trump officials like Chris Wright at the Department of Energy, Lee Zeldin at EPA, they are targeting stuff like the Clean Power Plan 2.0. And the EV mandates and all that to try to avert this risk. So there's a lot of work going on to do so, and still looking to see how it's going to play out.
Okay, all right. Thanks for staying on top of that, Robert. And we'll move over to Jared. This is very interesting now. So apparently, Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, has not explicitly rejected this. I don't know, maybe an offer she can't refuse from the Trump administration over tariffs. So what's going on?
Yes. So Mexico's had several officials in Washington this week and over the past week discussing tariffs with the Trump administration. The Trump admin reportedly recommended to Mexico that it impose tariffs on Chinese goods during the initial phase of this meeting last week. And in her press conference this morning, Sheinbaum not only didn't rebuke the idea, she said, well, Mexico has a history of tariffing countries that we don't have a free trade agreement with, which here on the map, you can see they don't have a free trade agreement with China, and that Mexico must prioritize its relationship with America. So she seems at least open to the idea, if not, actively going to implement it. Now, like I said, Mexico has no free trade agreement with China. Mexican tariffs on China could also significantly weaken China's grasp on Latin America. The Trump administration could use this initial consideration to begin driving out China's digital presence in Latin America, particularly Huawei. China makes up about 20% of all of Mexico's imports, with the largest portion of that actually being broadcasting equipment. So Huawei. Mm-hmm. And this would significantly mitigate China's potential spying communication capabilities in the American hemisphere, which all points back toward another question that we had back on Friday at a roundtable of, hey, what is the purpose of all this? And it's securing America's homeland and the broader hemisphere at large in order to help help contain China's rise.
Mm-hmm. Jared, this is interesting to me for a couple reasons. Number one, Scheinbaum here is continuing the policies of her predecessor and mentor Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, the previous president of Mexico. If you'll recall, a year or two ago, Mexico was reportedly flirting with BRICS membership. And this would have, Mexico's kind of like the crown jewel, I think, so to speak, for BRICS because it's so close to the United States. And AMLO was reportedly flirting with this, and just economic reality set in. And AMLO ended up rejecting BRICS membership. He said, we're not even going to apply for it. We're not even thinking about it. We're not going to do it. So this is interesting to me that says when President Scheinbaum comes out and says, well, we have to prioritize our relationship with the United States, because that's the exact same thing that AMLO chose. That's number one. Number two, one reason why the United States wants Mexico to tariff Chinese imports is because there is a correlation between the rise in tariffs against China and Chinese exports to Mexico and Mexican imports to the United States. Essentially, Mexico is bypassing these tariffs by exporting products to Mexico. It gets stamped with a Made in Mexico label, and then it gets imported to the United States in order to avoid those tariffs. So this is something I also expect the Trump administration to target in Mexico with talk of tariffs. All right, thanks for that, Jared. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, on that same train of thought, I was double checking their trade data over the past couple of years to make sure that China couldn't do like the same thing down in Central America or Southern Latin America. And Mexico's trade with them is actually so small that it doesn't look like that they have the trains in order to do that. So that would mean that this is pretty much a one and done.
Mm-hmm. You know, the United States actually does have a little bit more leverage over Mexico here. You know, we talked about Mexico not having enough industrial capacity for all the nearshoring. They will need greenfield investment, which means going into forests, going into raw land and building new factories. And this is one thing that Claudia Sheinbaum proposed back during her presidential campaign. She wanted to build 10 factories in near the border of the United States. I think it was Nuevo Leon. And they don't have the money to do that. And so this is something where the United States, the Trump administration specifically, could, maybe even direct foreign investment into those projects. Scheinbaum wants jobs. We need to nearshore more industrial production to the United States or to our friend, quote unquote friends to the south of us in Mexico. So this does seem to be an area where there could be some cooperation. All right, thanks for that, Jared. Let's move on. I think we do have maybe time for one question here. Here's a question. Has the Trump administration developed a strategy for dealing with Democrat lawfare and other obstructionary tactics? Robert, this is something that we have seen quite a bit of. Hundreds, maybe thousands of litigators were preparing to file lawsuits over the election, and now they've just moved on to filing lawsuits against the Trump administration over all sorts of things. So one thing that was proposed back there in the Trump administration was, I don't remember the mechanism by which this could happen, but what they wanted to do is say when a lower court, federal or district judge strikes down or says some Trump policy is unconstitutional or illegal, it only applied for that judge's jurisdiction. It did not apply to the entire country. And that was one of their plans to overcome lawfare during Trump 45. Are there any indications that Trump 47 is pursuing that, or do they have any strategy to deal with these we'll say legal challenges?
Well, I haven't seen like an explicit document, obviously on legal strategy, but from what I can see, I think there's three things. One, the idea that these district courts shouldn't be able to put up national level injunctions. I think they're waiting on a Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court to take up one of these lawsuits for that argument. The other thing they're doing is the DOJ started asking some of these district level judges to actually force cash bonds on these groups suing the Trump administration. I think with the idea is if they were to get that, to deter further lawsuits, because then these groups would have to put up money, actually put money where their mouth is. And then the other thing, interestingly, I think that we're seeing with like the Department of Justice announcing they're not going to defend these multi-layer protections for administrative law judges, and now with the Council on Environment Equality putting out an interim rule. I think the other thing they're doing is, instead of having Trump issue an executive order directing the agencies to do this, the heads of the agencies are actually taking actions that fall within their authority. And I don't think that's necessarily to completely stave off lawsuits, but I think the idea is to not give these, Democrat aligned and progressive aligned NGOs and attorneys general an easy target. Because during the I think it was the Doge and Treasury case under Tanya Chutkan in DC, the people who brought the lawsuit, all they had were media reports on what Doge was doing. And Chutkan actually said, like, hey, we can't make a legal decision based off of media reports. We need evidence. And I think it's one of those strategies the Trump administration is engaging is to minimize, those singular pieces of evidence these groups could use in court to hold up Trump's executive actions.
Mm-hmm. All right. Robert, one other point, or one other question, I guess, with regard to the Supreme Court. There is an ostensibly conservative majority, but let's go back to this the commerce case back during the previous Trump administration, where you had some groups suing the Trump administration for Commerce wanted to put that question on the 2020 census, requiring census survey takers to indicate their legal status. Are they a citizen or are they not a citizen of the United States, i.e. here legally? And Democrats had a huge problem with that because that would have meant that the apportionment phase, that would have reduced the number of residents in places like California and reduced the number of votes that California had, and also probably it would have made a huge impact in the 2020 election. And Chief Justice Roberts struck that down. He said, it would be legal for the Commerce Department to do that. But he said, like, they lied or something like that for their justification, and therefore he struck it down. Absolutely insane. Realistically, what's to stop the Supreme Court from making these asinine rulings on technicalities that says, where they say, well, this is actually legal, but we don't like the way you did it, and so we're going to say it's unconstitutional?
Yeah, they've usually used a lot of the courts in the previous Trump administration, they used the Administrative Procedures Act to do that, basically saying, yeah, they didn't follow the correct procedure to do it, even though it was legal. I think it is an open question of how the Supreme Court's going to side, whether it's going to side with the Trump administration or, all these groups when they do take up some of these cases. But there was a sign from Clarence Thomas that at least the conservative wing of the court, I think, could be swayed to say that they have to rein in the district courts on these national level injunctions, because there's going to come a tipping point where the court has to decide, are they going to uphold these national level injunctions, and then that gives a lot more power to the courts over the executive branch, or are they going to depower or disempower the judicial branch? And I think the Roberts definitely is kind of a wild card on that, because he's always said his whole goal is to maintain the legitimacy of the Supreme Court and the legacy of the Supreme Court. But I think this is one of those questions where, he might have to side with the Trump administration to basically maintain the legitimacy of the court and not really force the Trump administration's hand to basically ignore these lower district courts.
Mm-hmm. Let's just take this one step further. We'll go a little bit over our 30-minute time limit here. What at that point, if this does happen, let's say the Supreme Court rules in like a split decision, a very narrow majority, and Chief Justice Roberts says something similar. It's legal for you to do this, but you didn't go follow the proper process, or we don't like how you did this, and so we're ruling you can't do this. This is kind of like I forget which justice it was, but and the president, but basically, we had a U.S. president that said, well, you've made your ruling, now come enforce it. Do you expect the Trump administration to do that, to defy something like that, especially where it's just so cut and dry that it's legal for the Trump administration to do something?
Well, that was, interestingly, Florida's first governor, Andrew Jackson, who Trump is actually a huge fan of, as far as I understand. So we could see a situation where Trump says, well, you said it was legal, even though we didn't follow whatever, esoteric procedures you think we should have. So come enforce it. And I think that might be the tipping point where we see Trump start to openly defy the courts.
That would be, yeah, tipping point is an understatement. I mean, that would be the deciding factor. Basically well, I think we can all kind of see where this is going potentially here. So, all right. Thanks, Robert and Jared, as always. And thank you for watching and being here as well. This is going to do it for our for our morning briefing. We'll be back in your inboxes tomorrow morning, but also back on this show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.